Hello, and welcome to the first of 3 on-demand regulatory webinars titled Product Development and Regulatory Compliance, Maintaining Quality and Compliance, brought to you by Thermo Fisher Scientific and in partnership with the University of California, San Diego Extension Program. My name's Casey Kime, Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs, Clinical and Compliance here at Thermo Fisher Scientific, and I'm delighted to be joined by 2 experts today to help shed light and answer questions on integrating cGMP from clinical trials to commercialization. For those joining in, please don't forget to download today's companion deck so that you can better follow our discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Ajit Sim. Ajit established Sheba Biotechnology in 1999 to provide regulatory compliance, quality strategy, and support to the biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device industry. Ajit has worked with several multinational pharmaceutical companies and products over his 30 years in industry. Ajit has successfully hosted FDA and EMA inspections and conducted several mock pre-approval inspections which led to successful outcomes. He is a member of PDA and is an adjunct professor and instructor at SDSU in regulatory affairs. I'd also like to welcome Naresh Nayar, an experienced regulatory affairs leader with broad experience in companion diagnostic, CMC, and post-approval drug development activities. Currently, he is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Turning Point Therapeutics. Naresh is experienced preparing teams for regulatory agency meetings and interacting with US and international regulatory agencies. With a combined total of 50 plus years of experience as leaders in regulatory affairs in the biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device industry, both Ajit and Naresh are leading experts in the regulatory requirements for drug development and biologics. Welcome, Ajit and Naresh. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Pleasure, Casey. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey.
Great. Let's start today by outlining the importance of cGMP in today's current climate.
Casey, that's an excellent question. As you know, cGMPs, just to kind of elaborate, is current good manufacturing practices, has taken a completely different turn since the pandemic in 2020. And what's happened is our regulations have evolved over time. And it's interesting to note that the C in front of GMPs means you have to be current with our good manufacturing practices. And just as a comparison, when you look at good laboratory practices or good clinical practices, there's no C in front of it. And the reason being that when you finish drug development, you no longer conduct toxicology studies, what we call as non-clinical studies, or even clinical studies in humans. But what we do is we continue manufacturing the drug and it is being used out in the field as a commercial product. So we got to be current with whatever is there today with the technology and so on for detection of impurities, for example. And this is a very complex area, but I'll try to elaborate a little bit on what some of the challenges are. So today's cGMP is a very important component in what the US FDA is trying to do. And their mission is very clear, is to protect the American consumer with the pharmaceutical drugs that we take, including medical devices and food to a certain degree. So what we need to do is make sure that our GMPs are consistent with what is happening today. As we know, typically product development of a molecule takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to take it from early stage as a new chemical or molecular entity to commercialization. And in that time frame, the development process has to be robust, if you will. And what that means is that to get regulatory approval, whether you're on a fast track basis or whether you're going through the normal process of getting your drug approved with the US FDA, we have to ensure that our cGMPs are able to support the review process from the FDA or any regulatory body, as a matter of fact. Okay, so in today's climate with cGMPs, we know that, for example, being in San Diego, we have several hundred biotech companies here. And as we know, they're local, but they have a global footprint. What that means is that they are dealing with a number of companies internationally to outsource their product. And so while we take the drug to initiate human clinical trials first in human, as we call it, it is important to note that GMPs is very critical, as I mentioned earlier, for a successful outcome. And our regulations, 21 CFR, the code of federal regulations, 210 and 211, is for the manufacturing, processing, packing, holding, and distribution of pharmaceutical products. Okay, and this also includes some of the raw materials and components that go into the manufacture of the drug. And the FDA has defined a drug very clearly. And one of the key definitions of the drug is any component that is used in the manufacture of a drug is a drug. And to kind of illustrate the point, component means is any material that is used in the manufacture of a drug but may not be found in the drug is something very important. And what that means to define it is, for example, if you use water or you use a solvent in the manufacture of a drug, at the end of the manufacturing process, you may not find any of the solvent or the moisture or the water left over, but it may have left behind contaminants. Okay, and that is what we call is building quality through the process. I mean, all the components that go into the manufacture of a drug have to be well defined, well characterized, and we need to know where it's coming from. Okay, so given that, the regulations that we currently have, the cGMPs, are for the manufacture of a small molecule drug like aspirin, for example, or Tylenol, okay, or any of the other prescription drugs that are taken, with a script that we get prescribed, or there are also injectables, what are known as parenteral products, including ointments and so on that we take. And so all of this, including steroids, for example, and also some of the cutting edge therapies that we have today, all fall under the domain of our cGMPs. Okay, so this becomes a huge challenge that we have to apply these GMPs effectively from the beginning all the way to the end till we get it commercialized. And that's where the C becomes very important, is current. Okay, and along those lines, I have to emphasize that we need to interpret and apply these regulations correctly. I hope that answers your question, Casey. Casey, you're on mute.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Naresh, do you have anything more to add?
The only thing I want to add is to what Ajit said is I completely agree. There are also international aspects to the current GMP regulations, which are slightly different, varies from region to region. So you have to work really with the local folks in those areas, for example, Europe, Asia Pac, Australia, and other countries to really align your GMP manufacturing regulations or processes with those countries for a successful approval.
I think that's a really good point, and something at Thermo Fisher that we are very lucky to have regulatory affairs representatives in all the major markets. So as a company, we get that insight into all of those unique regional requirements. So definitely something to keep in mind.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
So the next question I have for you is, one of the key elements of following GMP is establishing traceability. And what does that mean, and what should you look for when securing GMP products or services?
Casey, that's an excellent question. And so we talk about GMPs, good manufacturing practices. And in essence, what GMPs means is that the regulatory body wants to make sure that you know where your components are coming from. Okay, and so traceability becomes very important, and I'll explain that in a bit why that is so important. But the reason that GMPs plays a key role with current GMPs is that with globalization, as I mentioned earlier, we need to know where the materials are coming from. Example, when we use a component, okay, for example, we use a salt that is coming into the manufacture of our product, we need to know where that salt originates from. Okay, and the reason being that somewhere down the road, when this is commercialized or even in clinical trials, while in clinical trials, if there's an SAE called a serious adverse event, what happens is that we have to conduct an investigation. And the investigation always takes us to the product that was administered to the patient population. So when you begin to investigate the final product, you look at all the components that go into the manufacture of the product. Okay, and this is where traceability becomes so important. So in the classes that I teach, I emphasize traceability being so important, and how to do this, how to ensure traceability is by answering the W's. What that means is, where was the material manufactured, whether it's a salt or a solvent or a liquid, where was it manufactured? For example, even the container closure system, where was it manufactured? Okay, who manufactured it? Okay, which country did it come from, the originator country? Okay, and also, do we know where it was manufactured once all the components were brought together to make the final product? Which room was it manufactured in within that manufacturing facility, the suite? And that becomes important because of potential cross-contamination from a prior product. Okay, and then we want to know who manufactured it, because we have employees who manufacture it. And it becomes important because we need to ensure that when I identify an employee, do they have the education, training, experience, or any combination thereof to manufacture it effectively following the procedures. Okay, and then we need to know which equipment it went into, because again, cross-contamination and equipment maintenance can play a role. Okay, and then very importantly, time. At what time, date and time was this manufactured? Because we look at chronology. Okay, we begin to doing an investigation. We look at all the knowns, unknowns, and assumptions to be able to identify. And if our knowns are very high and the assumptions and unknowns are very few, then we have a reasonable path to knowing where all my components came from, when it was manufactured. So this traceability becomes extremely important. And to illustrate the point, during a serious adverse event, or even during a product recall, let's just say, and we heard in the news a lot, we've heard in the news a lot, that products are getting recalled for contamination, for a potential carcinogen, and so on. The company that manufactures it, that holds the application, the dossier as we call it, has to recall the product, that particular lot. When they recall that product, they need to know where did all the raw materials come from. And typically the archival process of all our documents becomes so important that within a few minutes, we need to be able to know all the W's. Okay, because our track record is such that with our documentation, we'll be able to identify all the W's. Where did the raw materials come from? And with globalization today, it becomes very important because of the transfer of products and components and repackagers becomes extremely important for us to know that my raw materials are qualified and do not pose a safety risk. So this is where traceability becomes extremely important. And that's what GMPs are all about. Okay.
Thank you. Naresh, do you have anything more to add to that very interesting topic of traceability?
Yes, thank you, Casey and Ajit. I want to add that from a regulatory perspective, traceability is a key for a successful pre-approval inspection that happens before FDA or the health authorities approve the product. So when they visit the site, as Ajit will tell you, also based on my experience, FDA or the health authorities want to look at how you have managed your inventory and your deviations, all as a part of traceability. For example, I would just want to illustrate with an example. If there was a serious adverse event, where is the documentation for the looking at where the product came from? So all those investigations have to be documented on site and should be available to the FDA. So I think traceability is the key, and FDA generally not look at one, they look at the pattern. So for for X number of investigations, you maintained a similar process, you have a very defined path, partly because during the clinical studies, the information or the number of patients is very limited. However, if they approve it, the product goes global and there could be adverse events or things happening in other part of the world at a very large scale. So I think FDA puts a lot of emphasis on the traceability, repeatability, and following a consistent process and protocol for traceability of not only raw materials, where they're going, where they've come from, and what has happened to them since the investigation. So I think traceability, to me, at least from a regulatory standpoint, and to the health authorities globally, is a very key that you can actually successfully not only launch the product, but also maintain it after they have approved it.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And, Thermo Fisher is a critical raw material supplier to the pharmaceutical industry. And we know how important traceability is to our customers. And we spend a lot of time making sure that our raw materials have the full traceability documentation to help support our end users' risk assessment. So absolutely a very important topic. So for my next question, I want to talk about GMP interpretation. So often GMPs can be broad and they do leave some room for interpretation. How do you go about interpreting GMPs to ensure compliance?
That's an excellent question, Casey. So let me just preface that by saying, today we have programs at several of our universities. It's a Master of Science program in Regulatory Affairs. And there students get to learn all the various regulations and how to interpret them to a certain degree. So the theoretical base is there. One of the challenges we find is that when we engage an employee in a manufacturing process, they need to be able to interpret these regulations because the regulations, 21 CFR 210 and 211, which is the law, okay, has been written for the manufacture of different kinds of products, whether small molecule or large molecule, okay, and large molecule by way of recombinant proteins from or prokaryotic cell lines, okay. So these regulations are written for everything from small to large molecules. And one of the big challenges we have today, those same regulations also apply for advanced therapeutic medicinal products with some guidelines. Okay, so let me just kind of give a little difference between what is the difference between a guideline and a regulation. Okay, regulation is the law. That means you shall follow, as the FDA says. That means you have to follow it. Okay, whereas in the absence of a regulation, we have a guideline because it's not possible to get it into regulation because it takes time to get it through Congress, okay, and the Federal Register and so on. So we have a guidance in our place. The guidance is a good document because it has been vetted by industry thought leaders and regulators, okay? So guidance and regulations are two documents that we need to follow. But when you read these documents, they are so broad because they are interpreted for the manufacture of different kinds of pharmaceutical products, okay? So one of the things that I tell my students is you need to get experience as what I call as touching steel. That means once you read the regulations, you need to be able to go and work in an analytical lab. You need to know what an analytical equipment looks like an HPLC, GCLC, analytical balance, Carl Fisher equipment, and so on. Then you also need to go into the warehouse and see how raw materials are received, inventoried, either using a manual or an electronic system like SAP, for example, and also how materials are sampled because we want to make sure that the integrity of the material has been maintained. And then how the materials are all come together as a campaign to manufacture. So go into the manufacturing floor area and see how it is manufactured, how it's all brought together. And in the manufacturing floor, on that floor, you have a number of utilities that are supported. You have the infrastructure, you have the gases that come into play like compressed air, nitrogen, and then you also have autoclaves and deparginating ovens and so on. Whole host of equipment. Now, if you are looking at it from a document standpoint, it looks very nice. You're reading all of this. You shall have procedures. That means you must have procedures. Doesn't tell you what kind of procedures. You have to define it for your process. So we look at all of that, and then we say the interpretation comes from experience. Okay, and that experience, there's no substitute for. So you have to go out on the manufacturing floor, in the laboratory, and actually see all of this to see how it is all brought together. Okay, so our regulations are written for interpretation. The interpretation comes from experience, and then once we are able to interpret it, we apply it. Okay, that is where in our business the experience that we bring to the table as regulators, from the industry standpoint, is invaluable because over time we have assimilated a lot of this information on, for example, risk assessment. Okay, how do we conduct risk? When there is a deviation in a manufacturing process, there's an investigation that is launched. Okay, the next question is my final product safe? Before we can answer that, we need to know a whole bunch of items related to product safety. Is the product still safe? How do we do risk assessment? If you have never seen a manufacturing floor before, it'll be very difficult to apply these regulations that we have to follow through. So that interpretation and application comes with experience over time. Okay, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And, as a regulatory professional myself, I recall starting out and feeling completely overwhelmed by the amount of regulatory guidance and rules. But you're right, very, very right, that it takes experience and, working through it and understanding, laboratory testing through to manufacturing. And then as you grow as a regulatory professional, you're able to pull it all together and interpret much better than somebody who hasn't seen it. Naresh, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, thank you, Casey and Ajit. I think I completely agree with what Ajit just said, that the guidances and the regulations are very broad. When I am trying to solve a regulatory problem, I have a very specific issue. For example, I just give every time an example to folks that the ICH guidance, everybody knows about. There are a number of ICH guidances. Those guidances are generally written as a part of to support commercialization. When your molecule, your compound, your drug is in late stage development or about to be approved and marketed. It is very different for an early stage development where there is a room to really, based on the risk assessment, to really be able to pinpoint your specific issue within the broader guidance. So I think the ICH one is just a great example where you cannot apply ICH right off the bat for a phase 1 molecule. It's generally written for a commercial product. So that's why you need an experienced person to really connect the dots that this is a way to solve problem. Number 2 is that, again, the guidances are very broad, specifically if you're working in the area of oncology, if you're working in ophthalmology, if you're working in CNS, if you're working in diabetes, there are different levels of risk that the regulatory agencies associate that with. Again, a very good example is in oncology. In oncology, which is a life-threatening disease, FDA and the health authorities are generally flexible to be able to approve the products that you will have some post-marketing commitment. So they want to approve the product so that the people who are really sick, they can get the drug early, based obviously on the benefit risk assessment. But when it comes to therapeutic areas like diabetes, FDA and the health authorities, they're generally very strict. First, in oncology, you can do a fewer number of subjects, maybe in hundreds, a few hundreds, but specifically for diabetes, you need thousands of patients. So I think the guidances are very broad, and you need to find and you generally have a very specific issue within the company, within the project. So it is always helpful to have experienced folks who have that experience of working within the health agencies or have prior experiences at the CROs or at different companies to be really able to especially for the smaller companies, to be able to streamline what the regulatory guidance or approaches should be followed. So I hope I answered your question.
You did, thank you. It brings me to a final question though. What advice do you have for people working in cutting edge areas where the regulatory guidance is still developing? And a great example is cell and gene therapy. We've seen over the years now, we've got more guidance, but a few years ago we had much less guidance. So what do regulatory professionals do in that situation? What would be your advice?
So maybe I can take that, Ajit. So I think that, again, Casey, that's a great question. My experience has been working in therapeutic areas, really ultra disease areas, for example, muscular dystrophies, which also applies to the gene therapy as well, is to be able to interact with the health authorities as early and as soon as possible. It really helps for two reasons. One is the health agencies get to know what your cutting edge area therapeutic that you're coming up with. And the second is they are also able to provide some guidance. For example, in some areas, there is no guidance at all because there is no regulatory precedent. They even sometimes might have experience with health authorities. They themselves don't know what the regulatory approval path they will follow. So it is very important to interact with the health authorities early in the development and often, and they can sometimes help guide, what the endpoints would look like. For example, sometimes there are no endpoints. They can say, okay, if we can help you with you can come back to us with the clinical endpoints such as patient-reported outcome, where the patients is able to analyze themselves how they feel on a given day over a period of time, of course. So those are called patient-reported outcomes. So I think those are very helpful for especially for the cutting edge technology that the companies may be working on. That's been my experience with health authorities. And also the health authorities, they can figure out that this is a cutting edge technology. They're very flexible.
Thank you. Do you have anything more to add on that topic?
Yeah, Casey, so, these regulations, along with some of the new guidance documents for the cutting edge therapies, what we call it advanced therapeutic medicinal product, ATMPs, um, is quite fascinating, but challenging. And I have worked with a few companies recently where they are coming up with cutting edge therapies for the treatment of various disease conditions, mainly ultra rare disease conditions. And this is what we call as personalized medicine. Okay. So the one message that I always give my client is patient safety. Okay. Patient safety is of utmost importance. Okay. Following the regulations and the guidelines is for the benefit of whom? Is to ensure that the patient is safe. Okay, the regulators are comfortable, the shareholders are comfortable, the employees are comfortable, right? And all of these. So, given all of that, um, our regulations are simple to a certain degree for those who really understand it, and complex for those who are trying to interpret and apply it for the first time. Because I deal with some academic institutions, for example, where they have cutting edge therapies for the treatment of retinitis pigmentosa, for example. Okay, gene therapy. They're trying to get patients who are visually impaired get their vision back, and they made a lot of strides. One of the big challenges here is you're using live cells. Okay, you're genetically engineering cells, and what we need to look at is where did the cells come from? So there is a source that they came from. Either it's a research cell bank or what we call as the source material from a donor. Okay. Now we need to go back and assess, based on what we know, are there any adventitious agents that can potentially transmit to the patient? Okay. And how much testing can you do? And in today's climate, it's become very important with the pandemic. In fact, the FDA issued a guidance document on pharmaceutical manufacturing during the time of COVID-19. Is what precautions do manufacturers need to take? And this is again part of cGMP, because what was not current last year is current today. We got to move with the times. That means making sure all the employees are properly screened and checked and so on to ensure they are not transmitting any pathogens or adventitious agents to the cells that they're working on, because these cells are extremely receptive to this contamination because they are what we call as eukaryotic cells, right? So given all of this, I think with cutting edge therapies, same GMPs apply, but we need to be able to get experienced folks on board to be able to help and interpret them to ensure what we call as patient safety, which is the final and the utmost requirement when we manufacture a clinical supply. Yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Keeping the patient, front and center with everything we do is very important. And like you said, something very complex can be also broken down to something very simple when you keep that in mind. Well, thank you both for your time today and your insights. We've covered a lot of great information, and we also appreciate everybody joining in. So if you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking for some more regulatory insight, please register for our next 2 on-demand webinars in the series. And lastly, thank you to the partners at the University of California at San Diego Extension Program, where both Naresh and Ajit are professors of regulatory and compliance. We look forward for you to join our next seminar. Thank you.